There seems to be this sentiment about the whole term Do Not Resuscitate, DNR, and how it's kind of falling out of favor. I think in connection to what we just spoke about and how you can still get certain types of care, DNR is falling out of favor because of this, because there's a kind of like this negative connotation that's like on what the healthcare providers are not doing for the patient.
Right.
So this kind of might make some families or some patients uncomfortable with actually getting a DNR when it might be in their best interest, because it kind of makes them feel like they're giving up.
Yeah, I think, if we kind of imagine the standard patient that comes into my emergency department where they haven't had this discussion, most commonly the person is in their 80s at least. These are the people who end up dying in hospital. And even before their critical illness, they probably wouldn't be able to speak for themselves. And then, of course, the very, very distraught family member who didn't expect this pneumonia or this heart attack you're trying to broach this subject with them, and not only have they not had that conversation with their loved one, they're feeling just very upset that this has happened in general. They're not in their right mind. They're making decisions that are more guilt and emotion based rather than sort of practical, future oriented decisions. And so, if you call it a DNR, I mean, we still do call it a DNR for the most part in Ontario, but I try and explain what that means. But if you're not careful about how you're phrasing things, the family often will think that this is a giving up maneuver, and they're not doing everything that they can for their family member. Mm-hmm. And that means that they must not love their family member. Mm-hmm. And that's the sort of progression of thinking that is not true, mm-hmm. But is often how people will sort of frame it in their mind.
Yeah, for sure. And then they end up kind of potentially making a decision that might have gone against the wishes of the...
Right. And they'll say, well, you have to do everything. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, well, we actually don't have to do everything. We can do what we think is best,
mm-hmm. Yeah.
And, sometimes that's making somebody comfortable. Sometimes that's giving somebody an antibiotic and just seeing how they'll respond to that. And sometimes that's doing everything. But mm-hmm. There can be different answers to what's right for people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so in kind of response to this negative kind of connection of DNR, I've come across this new term called allow natural death, AND. It's supposedly going to be used instead of DNR to put an emphasis on what you're allowing the patient to do at mm-hmm. the end of their life. You're allowing them to have a peaceful natural death, and then that way you can provide comfort and support to the patient and their family, as opposed to kind of the other position, which is a bit juxtaposed. How do you feel? Is this a sentiment you agree with?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say at my workplace, I don't hear that term being thrown around that much. I try not to label it too much for patients. I try and just explain what the decision means and allow mm-hmm. them to make the decision without really saying DNR. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But and that's because I find that term not helpful, especially for families who hadn't discussed it before and are coming in during a time of crisis. But allow natural death, I mean, I like it. I think it sounds mm-hmm. a lot more friendly.
Yeah. I wonder if it's important to have a label on something in order to be able to abstract it out for someone and be able to have a definite conversation about it without having to kind of run around the subject.
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly there are some families who have been in and out of the hospital system and have talked about it with their family members and have made a decision. So that family member, I can just check with them and say, oh, I see that there's a DNR listed on the chart. I'm just checking that that's everybody's wishes still, because we always kind of confirm that. And they say, oh, yes. So it's useful to have the label then, because you know that conversation's been had before and you can just double check, mm-hmm. right? And there's a label that facilitates that. But for someone who hasn't had that conversation before, I find starting with the labels as opposed to the explanations is probably to the family's detriment.
Yeah, I can see that.
But I mean, if there's a sort of rebranding of DNR, and we just have a friendly,
but it might be for the best.
Yeah, I know. I think probably a lot of attitudes would change about it. Then you could just fill out an allow natural death form, and that does the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, ultimately, education is the most important driver of like making good decisions. So I really appreciate you kind of talking about this and sharing your expertise on this. Thanks for checking out that video. I hope you liked it. Here are a couple more for you to check out. And if you haven't done so, please subscribe to my channel.